Yeah, we might have another.
There she is.
There she is, okay. Starting our recording, starting our broadcast, and I will take a look at our attendees list as we go. I'll defer to you, Chair.
Okay, welcome to the planning board meeting for February 7th, 2024. I'll begin with the roll call. Alden Clark.
Here.
Beth Delisle.
Here.
Bob Cope.
Here.
Jamie Pennington.
Here.
Heather Rogers.
Here.
Rick Tainter is here, and absent are Charlie Palmisano and associate members Jen Bluestein and Brian Balcom. Are you able to hear me okay through this?
Yes.
Very well.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so tonight we have on our agenda one public hearing for 4 Otis Place. And we have under general business a request for extension. This is just a report from the planning director, approval of minutes, and discussion of various zoning issues. So we will begin with the public hearing. Douglas Deshane, 4 Otis Place, a special permit for nonconformities and a DOD special permit.
Andrew, can you pass those?
Will do, yeah, sure, appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, good evening. For the record, Douglas Deshane from Finner and Nicholson here representing the Newburyports with respect to their property at 4 Otis Place. I do have a PowerPoint up here, but I gave you a copy as well because sometimes it's hard to see the details of the plans, you know, from the screen. So I also gave you 2 enlarged plans that I need to point out a very small detail on. So I gave you a blow up so you'd be able to see that. And lastly, I provided you a copy of the letters of support that we've received from our neighbors. So that's the package that you have there. So if I could, I'll follow along the PowerPoint if we could. So again, Douglas Deshane with Finner and Nicholson here representing Stephen and Sharon Nitmeyer, who are here with us this evening. Also with us this evening is Eileen Graff from Graff Architects, who did the architectural work on the project. As a quick project summary. Good, thank you.
Sorry, and for efficiency, you can just say next to help one.
Great, thank you. The Nitmeyers would like to build a first floor and second floor addition to their current property and replace some of the windows in the existing structure. As determined by the zoning enforcement officer, the planned renovations would require 2 special permits from the planning board, one for nonconformities, the other because we are in the downtown overlay district. And then as part of that, you know, we needed to go to the historic commission for a advisory review, and we have completed that, and I'm sure you know that you've received their recommendations in the package. Next, please. The existing structure is approximately 1,288 square feet in size. It's 2-story, single-family home located in the Business 2 zoning district, the B2, as well as in the downtown overlay district. The existing home and the lot are pre-existing non-conforming in a couple of manners. The lot is relatively small at 1,616 square feet, when 10,000 is required in the applicable zone. The front lot frontage is 42 feet, where 90 feet is required. With respect to the dwelling, the front setback is currently 1.5 feet, where 20 feet is required. The side setbacks, right is at 0.4 and the left is at 9.8, again, where 20 feet is required. Rear setback is at 9.9, and the maximum lot coverage is currently at 46.8%, whereas 40% is allowed in the zone. So we do have pre-existing nonconformities as to the lot, as well as the structure itself. Next, please. The zoning impacts of the proposed use, these proposed additions, are that it will change the pre-existing non-conforming setback by 2 feet, therefore reducing the setback from its current 9.9 to 7.9. The proposed addition also changes the maximum lot coverage. I'm sorry, obviously there was a typo. from the existing 46.8% to the proposed 48.8% that I mentioned earlier. The proposed addition is actually quite modest in size. It will only provide an additional 161 square feet of living space while increasing the footprint of the building by less than 33 square feet in total. Ironically, because the lot is so small, that a small increase in the footprint of only 33 square feet actually bumps our lot coverage by 2.2%. So as you know, it's all a ratio, but this addition is quite modest. Next, please. So we went to the historical commission and provided them a presentation. There was some amazing historical information available on this property. And we went through that with the historic commission, but in light of the fact that this board is making the decision, I wanted to just give you a quick overview. Otis Place the road was laid out back in 1880. The homes along Otis Place were developed over the next 30 years to fulfill the need for middle-class housing near Newburyport Center Business District. And most of them were inhabited by the clerks and managers of the businesses down in Market Square. In 1884, Harriet J. Swap purchased a lot of land at the corner of Garden Street and Otis Place, which was, at that point, that area was known as Bannister Field. She paid a whopping $950 back in 1884. On that land, she built 2 houses, including the house at 4 Otis, with an architectural style known as Vernacular Victorian. However, Harriet never lived in the property, and she rented them. And they were later sold in 1893 to the Little family. In 1909, the Littles sold the house at 4 Otis to Bessie Moulton. Bessie was the wife of George Moulton. He was a manager of a boot and shoe store on State Street. So in keeping with the housing for our merchants, the Moultons lived there. They were actually the first family to ever both own it and live there, which is interesting. In 1919, the Moultons sold the home to Clancy family. And that family controlled the house till 1964. So they were there the longest of anyone. But then the house changed hands a number of times until it was purchased by my clients in 2021. So very interesting history. Next, please, in. So here's some pictures, just to give you an overview of the home. This is a picture of the front of the house here on the left side, as seen from Otis Street. And to the right picture, what you're looking at is, unfortunately, my client's view of the right side of their home is the location where the Institute for Savings is about to build a very large parking garage structure. Next slide, please. Again, this is more views to the right side of the home, and as you can see, the forms and foundation for that garage are approximately 7 or 8 feet off the side of the home. And then the picture on the right is really just standing on Otis looking to the right of the home. Next slide, please. Thank you. These pictures depict the left side of the home. And as you can see in that first picture, that is actually the front door to the home. It does not face Otis, but rather it is on the left side of the home. So you can see a close up there, and then to the right is the picture, standing at the street looking at the left. Next slide, please. And this picture is again looking at the left from the neighbor's driveway. So you can see that there aren't a lot of windows on either ends of the home. And then on the right here is, I apologize, but it was the only picture I could get of the rear of the home, because with the yard being so short, I couldn't get the camera to get a picture. So I stuck into the backyard of the neighbor, and they were kind enough to let me snap a shot. But that's the rear of the home as it exists today. I believe there's one more picture. Oh, no, great. So here we can now get to the site plans. And again, this is why I gave you some copies so that you can maybe see better. But as you can see, this picture depicts the the house as it sits on the lot today. The brown shaded area constitutes the proposed additions. The longer vertical brown section that shows the addition, that actually sits on top of an existing first floor. Whereas the, if you look to the left, there's the little square that's in brown, that's the proposed one-story addition. So there's two parts to it. To the left is a one-story addition. You'll be able to see it much better in the elevations. And to the right side is that longer section actually sits above an existing first floor thing. So that's why I said we're doing a one-story addition and then an addition to a existing one-story. And then, of course, you can see the stairs are going off in the back. There's currently a very wide stairway and porch. We're reducing that to narrow the stairs. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are our existing and proposed elevations. On the left, you can see the front of the home. And quite honestly, there is no change, or you will not be able to see anything associated with the proposed additions from the front of the home. And then on the left side of the, excuse me, on the right side shows the left side of the home. You can see in the top picture, the existing front door, as I referred to it. And then you can also see on that picture that the existing addition bump out on the back of the home. And then if you look below, that is the proposed structure. And as you can see, we've added an addition with a roof line above that existing structure. And then the part you can see there with the window, and I'm sorry, but unfortunately my laser pointer is not working. You can see where that new window is to the left of the door. That's the one-story addition they're proposing. Everything being proposed is off the back of the home. Next slide, please. This plan, and now I need to kind of step away. Since we went to the Historic Commission and received their recommendation, my clients and architect thought that it would be a benefit to the project and certainly a help to my clients to add a small little roof over the new back door. So if you there's nothing you can see on the front picture existing. And again, to the left, you can see the little roof over the main entrance. But if you look to the pictures to the right, and you look down below at the proposed addition, right there, that little roof, and it's what, 2 feet? It's only 2 feet out, so it doesn't constitute lot coverage or FAR or anything. It's just a small little roof over that rear door. And if you look at the front door, the main door, it's the same overhang. See, there's that little triangle overhang over the front door. We are just proposing to put one of those over the back door. It will match the architecture of the home and it will provide a little shelter from the rain if you're coming out the back door. So, Andy, if you go to the next plan. In fact, why don't we just skip down to the next one? So, and again, so this is the upper picture on the left is the existing structure as it is today. You can see there's some dormers there. There's a sliding glass door with a wide stairway coming off that back addition. And then to the right of that, there's currently nothing there. And if you look below, that is the proposed addition. We are eliminating the dormers, which the Historic Commission felt were awkward, and many of them felt it was beneficial to remove them. And as you can see, we have the second story being added, And then over to the right of that picture on the bottom left, you see the window, the larger window, that's the little one-story addition. And if you look at the new back door and look above it, you can see the little roof that we're now proposing to add there, that 2-foot roof to, just provide some rain protection. And again, it matches the little protection over the front door, or main entrance, I should say. If we could go to the next slide, please. These are the floor plans. You'll see that in the middle plan, you will see that that little infill one-story addition we're adding to the back is going to be a small office area. And adjacent to that will be a half bath. And then if you go over to the next picture, which is the second story, you can see that this is, you can see that what it allow us to do is to add a little more area to the master bedroom and a walk-in closet, which is the, this second story addition that we're adding over what's there today. So the first floor, the one-story addition will be a small office, and then the second story will add a little bit of room to the bedroom and a closet. So the next picture, the next slide, is actually a rendering of the home. And as you can see to the rear, that's our addition. That's the entirety of what it'll look like. Quite frankly, this is about the only view that you'll be able to see it, because if you go to the left side, there's a home and driveways and everything else. And I suppose if you're way down Otis, you might be able to get the angle, but really, and as the Historic Commission determined, that really is not going to be visible to anyone other than if you're in the backyard. And in fact, once the parking garage is placed there, there may not even be a view of this at all, unfortunately. In summary, and I appreciate your time in listening to me, there's no question that this home qualifies as a historical structure under the zoning ordinance, and that it is historically significant. We knew that, and Historic Commission agreed. However, the Newmeyers truly value their historic home and its significance in the history of Newburyport, and have been outstanding stewards of the home. They've preserved and maintained its historical character and architecture. And in fact, they went about on their own and replaced all of the sidewalks, the driveway, and the rear patio, which was asphalt and blocks. And they actually redid it by installing historically correct bricks, or bricks of emulated the era. So the sidewalks, the driveway, and their patio is now all in keeping with the historic nature. They also reached out to the Historic Preservation Trust when they took control of the home in an effort to document the history of their home and to archive it with the trust, and also to qualify to display a historic home plaque on the house. They did that of their own accord. As the first to do so, they hope that this would encourage more homeowners along Otis Place to embrace their historic nature and get their properties registered in this manner. However, it was very costly. They had to pay for both the historic research that was done by the trust, as well as the plaque and whatnot. So it was important to them to understand the history of their home and to maintain it. However, in order to make the home just a little more accommodating for modern living needs, they are proposing a very modest addition. And lastly, if we could go to last sign. As I said originally, the proposed additions are very modest. They're located to the rear of home and will not be readily visible from the street, nor will the addition result in an increase in the height of the structure. The proposed additions, including the materials and architectural style, are in keeping with the materials and architectural style of the existing home, the neighborhood, and the DOD. And this was certified by or agreed to by the Historic Commission. As required under the DOD, the proposed alterations will not disrupt the essential form and integrity of their home or its exterior architectural features, nor will it disrupt the lot or its setting within the DOD. The proposed alterations will be compatible with the size, scale, height, color, material, and character of the home, the lot, and within its setting. Just dead on compatible. And lastly, I'd like to point out that my clients have the support of many of their neighbors. And what I gave you a copy of is the Newbury's actually reached out to all of the adjacent neighbors, with the exception of the Institute for Savings. And they provided an overview of the project to all of their neighbors. And with the exception of one neighbor who's owns the property, but is a landlord, they're not in this area. They did not respond to 2 requests, but all of the other neighbors did, and they've provided us with either letters or emails expressing their support and appreciation for what the Nipmeyers have done with the home and, you know, in keeping it the way it needs to be. So it's a very supportive neighborhood for this project. It's certainly not going to have adverse impact on anyone, very modest in size, but it will allow a little more breathing room for my clients. So with that, and again, I will point out that the only thing different in this presentation from what the Historic Commission reviewed is that proposed rear, small roof over the rear door. And if you've looked at the Historic Commission's recommendations, they point out the fact that everything we're doing is in the back and that it's not going to be seen by anyone. It's, historically correct, it matches. And so I don't think they would have a concern with this, especially where we are emulating the cover that's over the main entrance today. And it will be in the back, and it's really just a very small consideration. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, and I thank you for your consideration of this, of these permits.
Thank you. Do any board members have any questions for the applicant?
Just to confirm, you are replacing several of the windows?
Yes, the windows that we're replacing I think were replaced in the 70s or 80s, and they're not in keeping with anything. The windows that we're gonna put in will, at least have the same design and shape as what we believe were the original.
Mhm.
And the
So those
Historic
are-
Commission was in agreement with that.
Yes, yeah, and those are the ones in the front that you show on the diagram,
Right.
that are going 2/2.
Again, the Newbury's are really, great stewards of this home. They want to bring it back to, its original glory.
Okay, any other questions? If not, we can open up to public comment for the public hearing. I can't see who's in the room, so I'll leave it up to the planning director.
Do we have anybody in the room? Okay, and Chair, nobody in the room, and we have no remote attendees this evening, at least at present.
Okay, we will close the public hearing and open it up for discussion and a motion. Andy, one thing I didn't see, I'm not sure whether this is necessary or not. Often we have, with a special permit, we often have conditions of approval. I see the findings in there, but I didn't see any conditions. Do we need those for these 2 special permits?
Thank you. Yes, I guess my recommendation there is just that the board included standard conditions as per usual. I guess the only question would be, are there any special conditions that you would recommend? But I would recommend the standard conditions we put on our permits, in special permits. Yeah.
Thank you. So any discussion from the board? And if there is no discussion, I could go straight to a motion.
No discussion? I'll make a motion to approve both special permits with the standard conditions.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, because we have members First of all, is there any discussion on the motion? And hearing none, because we have remote members, we need to do a roll call. So I'll start the roll call on this motion. Alden,
Yes.
Beth,
Yes.
Bob,
Yes.
Jamie,
Yes.
Heather,
Yes.
and I vote yes. So we have a unanimous vote in favor of granting the special permits. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your time and consideration. Hope you have a nice night.
Thank you. Okay, we're moving on to the general business. And the first item is the request for extension for 166 to 168 Route 1, the Minko project. Andy?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. A little bit of confusion, apologies that we actually have this on the agenda, although I think it's actually worthwhile in a way because I get to touch base with you about the timing of this project. As some of the board members may know, have been here longer, we've transitioned with some the format of conditions and permits. So there's been an evolution over time. We're dealing with small scale modifications of permits or even sometimes timeframe extensions here. Are things that can be done at the staff level. That's something that the board has decided, you know, in some cases, minutia, so to speak, and, you know, the board doesn't necessarily need to be bothered with certain things. So there are certain cases where you've put that latitude in the decisions. And obviously there are some situations where things are just sent right back to the board. They're just too substantive in nature to fit in that category. But here it was not picked up immediately. Jennifer, our zoning administrator, and Caitlin, our site planner, we typically look through our decisions because of course over time they're not all the same language and provisions for that because it's been an evolution. So it wasn't picked up here that the time frame extension, the planning board has specifically and explicitly put the decision that the planning director could extend the permit. So I guess it's more of a report that I do intend to formalize that extension of the permit. I don't have any issue with it myself, but obviously it's beneficial here because I get to consult with the board and see if we have any questions or concerns. Lou did in his permit. I did talk with him yesterday about several different things, you know, particularly this particular project, and he did note that as noted in the bottom of his letter, that they are planning on still proceeding later this year. They just want to make sure that, given that the deadline is approaching the decision, that that's extended a little further. So unless board members have reason to sort of revisit the entire permitting process for that project, I think we did end up with a reasonably decent, you know, site layout and all the things we worked out there. So my recommendation would be to just grant the extension, but I have obviously been talking with Lou about the timeframe of the permit, and there are good things that can come to the city from that: housing units, renovation, and, you know, revitalization of an area of the city, and then other things like subsidized housing inventory qualifications. So I don't know if you have any questions or concerns about it, but for me it's relatively straightforward. Yeah.
No issue with the extension at all. I'm just curious where they are relative to final drawings and are they finished with contract documents and they're?
Oh, on the construction, we didn't get into that level of detail. I know that they prepared all that and they're basically ready to go, as I understand it, although we didn't talk about the details of their package. As I understand it, that package is ready to go. They're really just closing the loop on the financing side. You know, he and I have been talking about you know, he feels that it's a little bit more difficult these days, and we've seen some of that in the pandemic, but he thinks that that's still something they can proceed with. I would note that we also talked about, in light of the other discussion item we have later on, the MBTA Community Story Avenue stuff, which will be discussed next week or 2 weeks from now, I guess, with the city council, which you've been invited to. I think I sent an email to you about that. He did bring up the issue of the affordable housing percentage, which I think I had mentioned to the planning board previously. And I have been discussing with the mayor and the councilors about this will be a highlight, I think, of the policy decision involved, because the 40R district was set up with a 25% requirement, and Lou has noted, and it's not unsurprising, that with the new guidelines from the state under MBTA communities legislation, the Housing Act that was done a couple of years ago, we are actually capped out under that program at 10%. We can only require 10%, and we can, as I described it, argue with the state, basically come back to the state and make a case with a financial analysis why we think it's feasible to go higher than that. But we are not able to go higher than 20% under that program. So part of our exercise, part of our decision-making process, we can, you know, modify maps and so forth, but we're gonna have to make some policy decisions. We can, you know, satisfy the state here and make things contextually appropriate reasonably for Newburyport, but we have to make some decisions about where we're gonna draw the line. And one of those is the affordable housing percentage, and he had noted that just the disparity, so to speak, between this project that's been, approved and has that 25% requirement, and now having potential for, zoning or projects elsewhere, and possibly under, similar timeframes, depending on where things go, where there's, a project where there's only 10% required, and that's a very big difference, I guess, for a developer right to carry that. So, irrespective of the particulars, I'm definitely a supporter of affordable housing and think we should try to aim as high as we can and count units on the subsidized housing inventory. But he did note that in the context of that that's a little more difficult to see here. Again, as I've said before, I think one of the strong benefits we've got in the 4-yard district is that we get 25% of the units that are affordable, not just 20, not just 10, 15 or 10. But also we've actually gotten credit, although they're not technically affordable units, we've gotten credit for 75% of those units on the SHI, the subsidized housing inventory, which has put us in that safe harbor status. And in effect, as we go forward, March going forward, and this MBTA legislation and the new zoning we're going to be doing in some areas of the city to satisfy the state, we will not be able to do that same thing because the two statutes sort of conflict with each other in being able to reach a threshold that it counts under one program or another. So I defer to the chair if he wants to add anything to this. So it looks like you might have lost the connection. Rick might have lost connection, but we'll keep an eye out. But just noting the fact that he does want to proceed. I actually, I did ask that question because I figured that would be the first question people ask will be not so much as a concern about giving, a little bit longer to get going on the project, but more so that, we don't want to see necessarily a long, time before that happens. And he did indicate that he wants to proceed later this year, so.
And is he asking for a change in the percentage of affordable?
He brought it up as a concern
Yeah.
relative to this project, whereas the other two projects are basically built out and finished and, for the most part, occupied, right, they're basically completed. It wasn't a discussion about 1 and 3 Boston Way, but he did bring up the sort of disparity here and a concern about it, and we went through the mechanics of the fact that, it isn't something where you could simply, make the case under MBTA and to the planning board and the city council here, and those, that we should just go back and revisit the permit and maybe lower the threshold to have comps to the new expectation for developers, right? I have pointed out that, even if there was a policy level agreement to go back and do that on a project like this, which is something that the board, really would have to pay in on, that it isn't just the planning board. I think that, the ordinance itself is actually structured to require that at the outset. It's not there are waivers that the board can grant under the 40-yard district. It's similar, I think, to what we'd be looking at in the Story Avenue area. You have the ability to waive certain standards, but that allowance is specifically for things like design standards and site plan standards, things like that. It does not call out specifically the affordable housing percentage in there as being something the board can waive or reduce. So that's a baseline requirement of the ordinance. I see that as a variance, and I'm not sure that the board, absent something from the city council, it seems like it'd be quite a deviation to try to, get that right. So it seems pretty clear to me that not only would the planning board have to revisit something like that, but also the city council. And so I pointed out the fact that there was some concern about that, that in either case, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about our 40-yard district, we're talking about the Story Avenue area, or any combination of how we draw the zoning lines and the requirements, that there'll be discussion about this issue. But I suspect that where we're going to be is that we're not necessarily going to lose ground in the existing 40-yard district. And so some might see that as retroactive, to what a project that's already been approved and, in concept. So putting aside for a moment the state, I reached out to them to have a little bit more detailed discussion about the so-called grandfathering of our 40-yard district, which is we're benefited here by the fact that this district was adopted previously. And then we can essentially grandfather the provisions in our district. However, that's according to guidelines from the state. The state could technically modify those guidelines, and I'm not sure they would at this point. They've sort of finalized them, but they did make a couple of changes before they issued the final version. So they could modify them further, but the way they're written right now, it's not 100% clarity as to whether or not they would, since we would be modifying some things, maybe expanding the boundaries, possibly removing one provision that deals with the bedroom side of things, which is something they don't want to see, the housing legislation, the limitations and that kind of stuff. At any rate, I want to make sure that we're able to maintain that ground essentially with the 25%. It says that we can maintain that even when expanding or modifying in the 40R district. But it's not 100% clear whether or not we still need to argue with them through an economic feasibility analysis in order to do that. And so I reached out to have a little bit more detailed discussion. I see Rick is back with us. Sorry, Rick, you missed a little bit of my summary, but I think you probably know most of what I spoke about, which is the affordable housing percentage. I was just noting, Alden had asked whether or not, Lou McCucci had asked about, making a reduction in association with the, outstanding or not completed yet project at 166 Route 1, Haley's site. And I said, we did talk about that. But I know the fact that it's not just the planning board, the city council will be involved, and we're gonna be engaged in that very discussion in the coming months about, where we draw the line in different areas. And generally speaking, I imagine we're gonna wanna keep, previously established territory and not necessarily change that. So that'll be discussion, and we can certainly modify or reduce those regulations, so to speak. But it's an iterative discussion, and there might be a very big difference between the old state policy and the new one here. It's a flipping it a little bit.
Good question, Andy. So to recap, am I correct in understanding that independent of the MBTA, the new zoning related to MBTA and the 40R zoning, if he were to downgrade his affordability from 25% to 10%, the pathway for him is not just a modification of his permits, it's new permits or a new variance?
He would effectively, aside from anything else we do with MBTA communities, right, going through that program.
Yeah.
The city council would have to go back to amend the ordinance, bring it down to 20, or allow the planning board to reduce or waive that, which is not currently, written in there. And then he would have to come back to the board to modify it. So it's both city council and then planning board.
It's pretty extreme.
Yes, and I think that the whole, spectrum of discussion about, and I'll leave it to all of you, and we'll hear, counselors and others about the whole affordable housing thing. I have concerns about the fact that we don't have the local control anymore to try to, aim high with that, so to speak. And that, when we get developers saying we can't make it feasible, I think there's a debate about whether or not that's going into private margin versus being passed on to the other housing units, the market rate units. I agree that happens. But I think as opposed to saying to the developer as well, we can see that you can only do 10%. We have to keep in mind that every time we reduce something like that, the expectation that we're talking about only at best 10% of the units being affordable. And that's only for someone who's making 80% of the area median income, right? So every time we reduce a threshold like that, we can get there in different ways. And I acknowledge that, some of these pieces of legislation and the way we do things are not necessarily the best tools. But working with tools we do have, it's disappointing to me that we don't have that control locally, that they've sort of taken that away as part of their guidelines here. My hope is that we can maintain some of that, and then we'll have a fair discussion about, whether or not we want to go lower. And I definitely would see other communities aiming at different locations, whether it's staying at 10%, not debating it, doing the fiscal analysis as some we're doing, and what we're doing as well. And maybe they're landing at 15 and they're stopping there, but there's a very big difference. I realize there's a small difference between 5% of units, right? And a 100 unit project like the Haley's project, it's about 96 or 98, I think. Let's say it's 100 units, 5% or five units is not significant overall, just because, it makes a difference, but it's not significant overall. But as a policy, I also have to consider the safe harbor status, and that, I think, if you're talking to the city council, perhaps even more so than the planning board, you might be thinking more about, design, site context, permitting, things like that. City council has to think about not just the planning board doesn't, but they're gonna have to think about that policy level question as well, to take a hit on the subsidized housing inventory of 75 units coming off. Brings us that much further away from a safe harbor status. So I have to be cognizant that that's something that I think is unfortunate that that's something that's also potentially lost there. It's a convoluted set of state statutes. I wouldn't necessarily argue for every provision or structure that's in there on any one of these statutes, but there's a complicated set of, 40R, 40A, 40B, 40, but in the context here, we're gonna have to make some decisions, and one of them will be, do we modify or reduce anything in the existing 40R? Do we try to expand or work out with that? state allow us to keep some territory, and where do we have something that's only between 10% and 20% to satisfy the state, and then from there.
Can I ask one more question?
Oh, yeah.
So with the MBTA communities and their lower affordability threshold, you said that the 40R can be grandfathered. Is that automatic, or does the city have to take action to get it?
That's a great question. So the way the guidelines are written, we have to submit formally, our applicant or proposal, what we want to do. And it definitely, the guys, so the legislature gave a pretty broad latitude, I would say. There are some basic provisions called out in this by the state legislature, but a lot of latitude is then left to the Department of Housing, what used to be the Department of Housing and Community Development, and is now, I have to do this every time, named the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. Give a lot of latitude to them. It's an unusual situation, I would say, in Massachusetts, because we're so home rule based that, but given the housing crisis and the timing, and everything, the economy and everything, that was, slipped in or included in this bill, and it basically gave some latitude to the state agency to determine what's a reasonable sized district, and, so like some things like that. And, in essence, one of them that we're getting down to here is the extent to which, some of these things can be sort of, where you can get credit. They had guidelines previously that required greater density, and they had sort of requirements that reduced that based on some feedback from communities. We gave feedback about some things, other communities, a lot of them gave feedback about, well, what if you're at the town line like this, should you be required as a community to do the entire radius within your community, when in fact you only have half the radius, the land area, so things like that. They made some modifications, but they have a lot of latitude, so it says that they can do so, but we do have to submit and propose that, and that's one of the reasons why, because it doesn't say definitively when it says the department can approve, one that's under a 40R that's grandfathered, they can count that area, as being satisfying. However, there's a presumption there that if there's anything that sort of conflicts, that we try to revise or resolve that. But it does allow us to keep that percentage, provided they're not having an extended argument with us over the economic feasibility. It's not 100% clear, the way the guidelines are written, whether or not, in order to maintain the 40R district, we also have to submit a pro forma analysis that says that's feasible. The way the guidelines are written, I would read them more generously, and it should be, in my view, read that way, but it should be read, I think, that we can keep the existing territory without doing the fiscal impact or economic feasibility analysis for the existing 40R district. For a new district at Story Avenue, totally new district, the way it's written, the guidelines are written, that should be something. I understand why they want an economic feasibility analysis, and I think that's defensible in their regulations to say that that's required. I think the way that the guidelines are written, it should be interpreted, in my view, very clearly that they can keep that, we can keep that territory, we should be able to present that to the state, they should be able to accept that. Unless we're talking about expanding the boundaries of the district, that we should be able to basically count this entire area of the district here, which is, I think, step one for us, right? And then to focus on, I think, Rick had pointed out previously, there are different areas around this, including going up with one and whatnot, that we might want to include as part of this. But given that we don't have to have the entire boundaries of the area right next to the train station, that's one of the other provisions here that we have like 7 acres we have to keep over here, but there's 35 acres total, at least we have to have somewhere in the city, that we have the option to put some of that over at Story Avenue. And I actually think that given that we want to modify that area, maybe, improve it in some ways, this is actually a beneficial thing to kind of do both at the same time. Take some credit for it, and, but the housing percentage, I think, is in my view, the biggest policy, putting aside the design and land use, is the biggest policy level thing I think is going on there that, has good and bad. It's gonna supposedly, streamline permitting. I don't have any issue with the as-of-right permitting as the 40R district does, but it has standards for easy, design, construction, and site design. But what I, do question is just the sort of taking away right out of the gates the ability to keep what we've already been doing. They're saying, all right, we're buying the argument that it's not feasible to do anymore, as opposed to saying, status quo, if developers don't like it, there's some provision where they can come back and argue, on their end. I think that'd be more appropriate. So that was maybe a lot more background, but I plan on speaking, giving a presentation a little more in detail to the city council next, on the 20th, and that's the next city council planning and development committee meeting. So I would invite, if you're able to come to that, we'll obviously be having at each of our, I will defer to Rick, but I think we're going to be at each of our meetings. If not, we kind of special meetings, right? We're going to be having a lot more discussion about this, but in addition to where you think things should be, or should not be, where height should be allowed, what parking requirements should be, and design guidelines. Again, I would encourage you to look at the existing 40R district so we can get your feedback on those type of provisions, anything to change, anything you would like to keep or not, where you'd like to see height or not see height, things like that, going in here. That would be helpful to have your feedback, but I would encourage you to come because having an iterative conversation together is sometimes more efficient when we can get feedback to each other, we can learn from each other. And whether councils get more benefit from the design background or, background that board members have here, that can all help to inform the overall discussion and sort of move it along in one way, shape or form. But reaching consensus in zoning is sometimes difficult, so we'll pick up that discussion. Rick, did you want to,
Well, just a couple things. So have we, was this item C on the agenda then? We've moved from A to C?
yeah, apologies.
So
yeah.
I wanted to ask,
A little bit more context on the request for extension, which, and so then unless there's any questions about that, I don't know if does that make sense that we're about that item? Okay. And then C, I guess I just sort of rolled in that a little bit too much. We probably covered that, most of that ground, but, do you want to do that or you want to go back to the minutes?
let's go back to the minutes and maybe we can wrap up C quickly. So, the item, under, approval of minutes, of the January 17th meeting, Beth and I were both absent, so we'll have to abstain. Could I have a motion and are there any changes to the minutes?
I'll move to accept approve the minutes of the January 17th meeting.
Second?
Any discussion or changes or ready to move to a vote?
Nope.
Okay, so I'll call the roll. Alden,
Yes.
Beth will abstain. Bob,
Yes,
Jamie,
Yes.
Heather,
Yes.
and I abstain. Okay, minutes are passed. Okay, back into Story Avenue MBTA Business Park housekeeping.
Do we
Hey,
need
Andy,
to-
I,
Hold
can you give us an update on where we are with consulting? And also, I think at one point you had talked about getting together a subcommittee to look at, or some type of ad hoc committee to start looking at this. Can you give us an update on all that?
Yeah, well, I defer to you on that piece. The group, I actually had wanted to early this week, reach out and try to schedule something with the group, so I'll be doing that probably tomorrow. Yesterday, we had a discussion with the Department of Public Services about we're pointing on the consulting end for the water sewer build out analysis part of this. We are working with the regional planning agency on a couple of pieces, but one in particular is this economic feasibility analysis. I'm finalizing scopes for a couple of contracts for, one has to do with the rendering, sort of providing some visuals for this. The other one is the working out the text, basically the tweaks that we're gonna be making to the zoning, basically working with the different inputs. So whether it's a markup from, 20 different people, a series of meetings that we're having and basically modifying that document, keeping it up to date. As we go forward, I'll be coming back to you with some thoughts I have here about the boundaries of certain height allowances and things like that, similar to what we had in the 40R district where we had, greater height was allowed near the train station. And I also should note, although it's not consultant services working directly for us, for more background, I won't go through with you. We happen to be in a working relationship with the Harvard Kennedy School right now. They have a course they're doing in the spring, and so there's like 40 students or so that ended up coming up here last Friday. The mayor and I went in on Wednesday, did a presentation then, and then on Friday they came in to do a tour, a walking tour of the Story Avenue area. We gave them some factual information, and they are looking at a couple of different things. We'll see what they produce, but they are looking at possibly giving us some of their own sort of visuals and whatnot. One of the things we talked about was trying to prepare sort of a before and after kind of comparison. If we were to take it, this is not our area, of course, but Rick was nice enough to share one of the books. We collect all these visuals, of course, as I'm sure like the Jamie knows, design people, we keep all these, right? But this was just a good example for one of the books, and just showing whether it's a hand drawn or I actually, like the idea of having sort of a 3D model we could work with, but just showing before and after, how the, allowances for height and the mixture of uses and design guidelines and so forth could create that area. This was done similarly back when the 40R district was done years before I got here, when it was discussed as Little River Transit Village. And so one of them is visuals that they might look at. The other one is the economic feasibility analysis. That's housing, requirement and what's feasible for a developer. It's been suggested they follow, the state's, structure for all that stuff. So that we kind of see, it might be independently results and feedback we get from them. We're not going to use any of that. MVPC, obviously, we'll be working with them, and we're going to see what they're doing with other communities on that same analysis. And they may also do a analysis of some of the fiscal impacts on the community. So thinking about, the financial impact of additional growth that might happen, right? New housing units, and things like that. So a little bit more of an assessment of how many bedrooms might we expect at the end of the day, that kind of thing. So school age children and whatnot. So we'll see what they produce. We're not in direct control, obviously, of that scope, so to speak, but we've given some suggestions of what we thought might be useful on our end. And they are interested in doing it. They find it to be a very interesting project, amongst a few others, I guess, they're looking at. They seem to have some strong interest in this. So that's kind of a quick synopsis of that. There's a couple of different irons in the fire, sort of pulling information together for different pieces of this, but we're going to start getting into the nitty gritty, particularly next the meeting on the 20th with the council, which hopefully some of you can attend. We're going to start discussing, the pros and cons of different pieces of this. I've had at least one counselor, express concern about the sort of state mandate piece of this. It's obviously controversial depending how you look at it. But as far as I'm concerned, and unless the state were to change any sort of guidelines, we're obligated to complete something here. So we do have to march forward with something that will comply. We may not agree with, the policy overall and that sort of thing, but on this or that. But I think that this overall process, I think, can be beneficial, particularly for the Story Avenue area, where we've already tried to make a lot of these changes, I think, around the train station with our 40R district. I actually see some of the more substantial benefit coming in the Story Avenue area, and whether or not we use all or part of that area, to qualify for MBTA, I think we can sort of work hand in hand as they look at it.
Great.
Okay, that was one question I had, is whether we were working towards that, including that as part of the MBTA.
Story Avenue.
The Story Avenue.
Yeah, it is a bit iterative because a part of the reason I think it's beneficial is we already plan on, I think, again, this is sort of going along this vision that, the idea that we want to do this, but we already want to change the area to allow housing. We already make it more of a mixed use kind of area, walkable, a little bit more of a village node, so to speak, as opposed to just strip mall anywhere, and it doesn't really represent Newburyport as you come in. So it could be that sort of third node within the city, a sort of triangle, these about three core areas, and then we have, of course, the National Register Historic District area, which we can direct some new growth and interest in those areas and help some of the character, which is obviously a routine issue in Newburyport. So in some of those other areas by sort of alleviating some of those pressures for new housing units and whatnot. But I think there's benefit in us, in addition to what Rick had suggested, which is we have other ways to, again, for lack of a better word, gerrymander into the map to satisfy the state. I use that term mainly because when we have to satisfy the state, we also want to make sure it makes sense in context here. So, we might want to run the district up with one, and that's good to change things, or just take credit for areas that are already developed, for instance. And Rick had pointed that out, I think, a couple of meetings ago in a president's slides he did. We also may want to take credit for what we're doing over at Story Avenue, and that's partly an iterative kind of process. For instance, we could take credit potentially over at Story Avenue, or take credit, up with one, and maybe the council feels more comfortable with a piece over Story Avenue and feels less comfortable with one piece. We may recommend it with one piece. It's a little bit of an iterative discussion. Some of it won't be, have a significant bearing on X, Y, or Z. Some of it will, and it's I guess I would say that there's enough parameters going on, so to speak, that we'll have to kind of discuss what people are comfortable with, and then we can basically codify that accordingly. And I think it's pretty, in my view, it's relatively straightforward amongst the options we have to get to a result that satisfies the state and is appropriate for Newburyport. But we'll have to decide where we want to take credit, essentially, and if there's any desire to kind of reduce thresholds down to the 10%, or find a battle for 15% or 20% or something like that versus the 25 in the 40R district.
Right. Can I just go back to just a little bit of baseline setting, because I think I'm more familiar with the MBTA stuff that was originally put out. And, but then, given that there was some discussion between the towns, cities and towns and back to the MBTA and the state, where you were talking about, we only have a half of the radius. And so what things did change? Did that change?
So
the
like, for
number
instance,
of
one thing is they gave us.
units we were wired?
Yeah, one thing is they did acknowledge the town line issue that was
Yeah.
coming up, right? There were some other adjustments they made, like one that's notable is, giving a little bit more flexibility for other areas. That are not, direct, like everything being as concentrated around the train station or.
Right, the
the
percentage that we had to be
The
within
percentage
half
had
a
to be
mile.
within a radius, right? They still want to be in a logical location, like they, Story Avenue makes sense with transit, essentially, we have a regional bus service that goes through there, the C&J bus, parking lot's a little bit, we debate that right now, right, it's not functional, in its full form right now, but, that seems like a logical location, they might question, other locations. The 40-hour program looks for that kind of stuff, and I think the MBTA program, right, is looking for the same kind of stuff. But we first start with the train station, we just happen to have been a little bit ahead of the curve by, having this 40-hour district essentially being somewhat in line with what they're looking for here, having done it, through a different statutory program previously.
Okay, so I thought the number was like the 1,200 or so units.
Yeah, so-
Did that change? Because I thought in the email that you sent, I still saw that 1,250.
Yeah, I apologize, I don't recall off the top of my head the original guidance piece, for that component, but, I think that, if I'm not mistaken, I think the number might have stayed around the same. But 12, I think it was a slight adjustment, like a very small, wasn't like significant. Anyway, 1,292 is the current number of units, and if you were to take the entire sort of area that we're getting credit for, that's the number of units they want to see us produce or allow, essentially not necessarily, we don't have to produce them, they say, I don't think you don't have to build any of this.
Yeah.
But we know when we zone something, obviously we assume people are gonna permit, so, 1,292 units, there are different overlapping provisions, so. You have to satisfy each of the individual provisions, but you can do it in different ways, so. We could have, the minimum 35 acres, or we could, and sort of densely, put all that density in there, or we could have a larger district and spread out the density a little bit. But there's also the floor that they put of 15 units per acre. So, one of the things that I put in the memo and talk about more is just the 40-hour district is about 40 units per acre as a density. And so, if you look at it sort of a comparison, we could have a smaller district, and then part of the policy is how wide of an area do we want to affect? Versus do we want to have greater density like this? So again, I think we try to get as much mileage as possible out of the 40-hour district. And then work off of that, mainly not so much because we wouldn't want to do similar changes elsewhere, but more because it allows us greater freedom to control what's happening there, whether it's the affordable housing percentage or its design guidelines or permitting process or whatever. Feel free to get another question.
Just another question concerning the Story Avenue area is what we're working towards, creating a new ordinance that would cover that, similar to the smart growth one, has all the various conditions and so forth in it. Is that?
That's why I point to the 40-hour, there are a million different variations of this. Rick, I know I spent years, looking at all kinds of variations of this as I have. There's a million different ways to do it, but in essence, they're looking for a similar structure, which is, particularly for multifamily, they're looking for as of right, which is like our 40-hour district. That was the same thing the state wanted to streamline there, was as of right, housing. But they wanted to understand local context and allow some latitude for design standards to make sure it kind of came out reasonably decent, right, both the site and the building. We proposed at the time design guidelines both for the building and the site. We're looking to maybe update, improve those. I've talked with Livable Streets and we're Livable Streets group. We would like to think about, do we expand the bicycle parking requirements? Do we look for more, cover for those? Do we have more EV charging stations that are either ready to go or, have conduits run to them? There are more progressive or updated design guidelines or things we might want to incorporate in there. So from the spectrum of all the things that you've seen and all the things that we've seen, the only reason I point to that district is it's a similar structure what they want, and I think it makes sense to kind of model off of something you're all familiar with as a board. You had changes in continuity. As a board, you've permitted a similar type of way, and so that makes a lot of sense to use that framework. But I think we have to decide in context where here in the district we allow height and density, just like we did in our 40-hour district. We allow greater density around the train station, and then it tapers off outside of that, and then further so as you get to State Street, because we wanted to recognize the residential neighborhood and kind of downscale a bit. So there are basically three sub areas, if you will, in terms of height allowances, for instance. We're gonna want to do a similar kind of discussion for the Story Avenue area. We have this question mark about the state land, whether or not that ever gets, comes along, but I think we want to consider zoning that would make sense for that, should that ever, be mobilized. And we floated that with the state, we just haven't seen, we're gonna, see where that goes. They have expressed interest in using, if something is deemed surplus by the state or partially surplus, or could be multiple purposes. The state is asked to, work with us on trying to create housing even using state land. So I'm not suggesting we take away the park and ride component. I actually think that's a good thing to have here. But I think it's a question whether or not we can do multiple things, I guess, with that parcel as well. So again, we just want to look at that. I think my primary focus in near term is that something like this would happen. And as we all know, the Kmart site is vacant and there's interest in housing there. We happen to have heard from Mingo about a project here. They're also interested in coming forward. So we might actually in the coming year see something there, coming forward for these, things based on this discussion. But those might be early, and then other areas might be, in the future.
The other thing I was curious about, this, we've talked about the whole Story Ave area, the big shopping is sort of being overparked, as far as there's more parking spaces and stuff, but given the current zoning, is there really a surplus given the square footage of the commercial zones there? Are they providing more parking than what's actually required in the current zoning?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't actually, I didn't run an analysis based on, I don't recall the top of my head where they follow that, but I definitely can see that there's a sea of extra parking that isn't necessarily used.
Right.
And I think the main thing is irrespective of where they are with current parking, I can go back and we can check that. A lot of this stuff was permitted a long time ago. And there was a carryover of like subdivisions and things kind of freezing, standards and whatnot. So anyway, the long story short is I think it matters a little bit less as to whether out there any access, but they probably are, perhaps, I think here. But the sub result is it's more about, do we allow shared parking to reduce our ratios? Do we want them to hide the parking behind the building? Do we want to, try to encourage them to put it underground or in a deck, hide it somehow? In the case of the Kmart, what we've discussed is that they would try to hide it under the building essentially. So as much of that parking would be almost all of it under the building. But again, that's part of the discussion, I think, is do we reduce parking and do we try to hide it aesthetically?
Right, because it just seems with the existing zoning and with the density that we're looking at for the MBTA, that would require a fair amount of parking.
Well, that's true, but I also would argue that there's a fair amount of parking that can be shared. That parking that's not utilized at night
Right.
there for the shopping can be used for residences, right? So it's, we can debate when things are happening, but it's a chicken or egg thing. But if we never change our zoning, we never have shared parking, we're always gonna have excessive parking, we're gonna create neighborhoods that don't make any sense. But
That's one of the things we're considering, is whether to reduce that ratio of parking.
either ratios or essentially, recognition in one way, shape, or form. There's different ways to do it, but recognizing the shared, allowance, for parking, that you don't necessarily need, spaces for every individual use as if they're operating simultaneously if they aren't, right? And I think that's something that I think would be beneficial here, in addition to getting buildings up against the streetscape, putting parking behind, and not having the sea of parking being the main thing that people see. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions about, yeah. Defer to you, Rick.
No, I was just asking whether anybody else had any questions. I can't tell from here.
I wasn't sure, I did put in a note in the email, by the way, in case we happen to have enough planning board members showing up at the meeting on the 20th. If we happen to think we're gonna hit the threshold in which, that's the only reason I put that in there was, we happen to think we're gonna hit the threshold in which we have a quorum of the planning board, I wanna just add a posting just to show that, for the meeting law, but that's not my significant concern, it's just a note that, I don't know whether, how many of you, now maybe thinking about it or will show up. So, if that's an issue, we can throw something on the calendar, but otherwise, hopefully a few will be there to discuss that.
So what is the concern with that, as far as the number?
Oh, just that if we have a quorum of the planning board, even though you're not a regular meeting, if you're meeting, or it would just better practice to basically post it, even though it might, we can never know definitively, but if a board is gonna show up in its quorum, it's good to post it, just so people don't brag about, that sort of thing, so. Not that I necessarily think this is the instance in which someone would complain about that. Nor that I necessarily expect all of you to show up for that discussion there, but I'm trying to get, these simultaneous discussions and feedback, so particularly given that the council has to decide on the zoning end, what they feel comfortable with, what they want, and what they don't. Same thing with you, what we feel comfortable with, like to change or add, looking at the 40 yard as a framework. Are there any, there are projects elsewhere, you'd like to see this or that, you wonder if the guideline can be put in there, you've seen a guideline somewhere else. We think we should insert that provision, that's the kind of stuff that we're looking for here, and so we can kind of integrate that in the overall framework. But I think ultimately speaking, the way I view it is we're looking to do a similar thing as the 40 yard district. Here, I'd say there's a lot more commercial, that, perhaps, I think we want to maintain the overall proportions of maybe, at least, but add the residential and change the landscape to be something that's a little bit more of a village as opposed to, just a designer.
Andy, the, last year, the council was unable to look at our short-term rental zoning because of the budget. I think one of the things to really impress on them on the
Yes.
20th is that they don't have that option this year. They really have to be able to hold public hearings on zoning and get through the zoning by the time that your grant deadline comes around. So that's an important thing to let them know early.
Yes, thank you. It's a very good point. I have been talking with counselors, and I will be working closely with both the council president and the committee chair, planning and development committee chair, on that very point to try to make sure that that's carried through for a point of continuity. And you're right that the council tends to, in the spring timeframe, become very consumed with the budget cycle. And it doesn't necessarily need to push everything else out, right? There is the ability to have another meeting. So while we might see a little bit more of a gap of their attention as they're focused on this budget, I think we try to get as much feedback as we can early and maintain, like Rick said, through that, it has to be done because we need to reach a finish line with something we all have consensus over at the end of the day. And all those discussions do take time, and we can prepare something responsive to that, but we have to have that consensus and feedback from counselors. That's one reason why it asked it not to be just the 3 members of the 11-member city council, the planning and development committee, but actually posted as committee of the whole, so that all councilors can attend. I've asked all councilors to attend. I don't know whether they all will. But in these discussions, we try to get feedback from every councilor, whether or not they're, initially engaged, on their own, we reach out, but try to get as much feedback as possible so we don't have, last minute concerns that could have been raised, oh, I like this, right? I don't like that, we can't satisfy everybody, simultaneously, of course, but the earlier we have the feedback, the easier it is to satisfy folks. And we do need to make sure now, having a relatively newly established council, we have to make sure that the new composition of the council fully understands this piece of legislation, what is required here. Generically, I can say we know what needs to be done, but we have to make the policy choices involved that go along with the map and some of the other things like the housing percentage of those design guidelines and that. But we'll need feedback from councilors on that before we can prepare a package that is ready to submit to the state and then sponsor for the city council. We're not going to go with the whole route until we know we have something that's reasonably well made.
Okay, anything else on the this zoning discussion?
No, the only other thing, it may be more of just as a note for you, Rick, and in context of the rest of you. Rick, if you happen to be available, I think you're participating in the discussion with the regional planning agency and EDC about our scope with them, if I'm not mistaken. If not, I can make sure that Ian can back you into that. We have a Zoom, I think, a week or so from now, maybe.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear when this was going to happen.
I think it's the next week or so. I can double check in my calendar,
Yeah.
but I think that you're on that Zoom invite from Ian. If not, I'll just want to make sure you're added to that with Ian and I.
Okay, yeah.
We can double check, but I just wanted to flag that. The other thing was did you want me to speak to the other updates from planning director? Because there was one there I was going to mention.
Well, I had 2 questions actually.
Sure.
First one was, I understand that the discussion didn't get very far last night on the global rezoning, and I'm wondering, what the updated timeline is and where this is going.
Yeah, let me know if you want more detail. There's a lot of different pieces to this one too. Actually, a relatively small piece of property, but a lot of different things that have gone into the discussion thus far. So I'm completely not covering the entire landscape here. So right now, there are a couple of different, there's like a tripartite arrangement basically between the landowner, global, a local development team, which I'll say is Grassi, he's the person interested in buying, has a purchase and sale agreement, we're not part of that, right, it's a separate agreement, but we have a development agreement with them, to kind of set a minimum box around the, what could happen in that site, that was basically a minimum standard, we went before any of us felt comfortable with talking about, zoning change and which have been brought up to make residential feasible. So without going over all the background that you previously heard from the hearing back in November, the council has to take its action because of the 90-day requirement under 40A. When the hearing closes, there's 90 days for them to act, and all this got carried over from last year. There was a request for us to see if we could get from Global a commitment on a deed restriction to prohibit, to make it clear there were not going to be any commercial uses there ever again. Only residential, and we were able to secure that and obtain that basically a day or two ago. But it took a long time to get that resolved. Unfortunately, there were a number of attorneys involved, and even though my view was a relatively simple document agreement, it took a long time to get that sorted out. So that clock is now tight, as opposed to having more window where we were trying to get wrapped up end of last year or even right after the new year. Didn't pan out. So not through any shortage of effort. So that is now poised to come out of committee from last night's meeting. All three members of the committee voted to recommend the adoption of the as amended version you discussed on November 15th of last year. I have worked hard with the council president, the committee chair, and the clerk's office to try to ensure that the upcoming council packet includes everything that's sort of relevant, so they have that. And I say that mainly because the planning board's report that came out in December of last year didn't make it into the council's packet in December, so they didn't technically receive or see that report. And so even though they had gotten it from it, it wasn't received in the docket. So I want to make sure there's no question they have everything in front of them. There are a bunch of different moving pieces to this, but there's a development agreement. There's now an agreement to place the restriction pending the council's adopting the zoning. The restriction gets it put in place, saying no, nothing other than residential in the future, irrespective of whatever zoning laws. And then the council has to do 2 readings. This is an odd provision in my view in terms of efficiency, but our own council regulations require 2 votes on things, a number of different things, and that may be beneficial in some ways, but I think it's a lot of ways inefficient. So they effectively now, because of the crunch timeline, have to, but we're closing the loop with them, but they will have to vote on 2 readings, 2 readings as we call it, 2 votes, waive the rules on Monday night and this coming Monday night and do the vote for the zoning in one night rather than doing it in 2 nights. A first vote and then a second vote they would do on the 26th, I think it is. They do it again. I'm not sure, frankly, that provision accomplishes a whole lot, having seen over the years, just, 2 meetings of the same subject matter for the most time, same results. But that is something they'd have to do procedurally now to sort of resolve that timeline. But in my view, everything is in place at this point. I recognize that there are a few butters who do have some concerns about, what might happen in detail on that site, but we have not really heard anybody who has said that they're uncomfortable with the overall development scheme that's been proposed for the site. So the 4 units, 3 in the main structure towards the street intersection, and another little sort of accessory structure in the back, kind of carriage house style. No one has really been saying that this is not a good plan or the plan they're comfortable with. There's been a few details that people want modified, but not something that you would find atypical being addressed before the Board of Appeals. In this case, the permitting board, if we have, you debate which board, but in this case, it would be the ZBA based on the scope. So in my view, I think we have a fair amount of control over what's going to happen here at this point. I think we have a pretty good arrangement based on the idea of getting rid of the gas station, making it residential, cleaning up the intersection. And I'm not particularly worried myself that we're going to get a bad result there with the local controls we have. But there have been some concerns expressed that we haven't maybe gone far enough. To Rick's question, I think I was actually part of what I was going to ask actually on that front was, if you happen to be interested in coming to the council meeting on Monday, some arguments were made last night, Councilor Needham, and there were a few others who chimed in, but there were some arguments made about things like, is this spot zoning? Again, I can tell you right now, it is not spot zoning. To change this corner, the other 3 corners are the same zoning district. It used to be R3. There's a rationale for doing it, et cetera. So dispel the rumor that we sometimes hear people throw out arguments and not really know necessarily the case law or relevance, behind it. But it's not spot zoning. There was expressed a concern. I think the major reason why there might be some debate on this on Monday night. Again, in my view, it makes sense to do the zoning change. There was mainly, in my view, some debate amongst councilors about the definition change. So the change here that's being discussed and was necessary for this project included both the map change for the district to R3, That's because this district, even though it was originally incorporated in the High Street district, is actually not representative of all of the type of lots that that district was intended to protect. Though that was intended to protect the larger estate properties from being subdivided and built out, right, keep the character. These corner lots, and some of them, this is one example, are way undersized. You can't even do a single home in, under the district, the way it's set up. So, it's not surprising that there are issues trying to get something to happen here. So while we mobilized getting global to do something and make it residential, we also are trying to get something to be feasible there so it can go ahead. And I think we reached that, reasonable good point here. We had somebody propose 6 units at one point, and my response was, don't even come back, because it's not gonna, it's not gonna be an issue. They didn't come back, and we have a project, it's 4 units, it's gonna be, I think, reasonably, good for the area. I think that would have been uphill battle if I put 6 units in here, and, so that didn't, they didn't come back, but I think we have a good plan here. And I realize that there's still architectural elevations and discussions about grading and, things that might come up very permitting, but all that stuff, just like the planning board, if it's the ZBA or the planning board, both boards can review those things, require X, Y, or Z, they can continue the hearing if they're unsatisfied, they can require peer review. And they're gonna have detailed elevations and whatnot, recent years, both boards have fully incorporated basically the expectation that there's clear drawings for elevations.
Is there any controversy over the change in definition of multifamily?
Yes, sorry, thank you. Yeah, that, mainly the debate about that was the sort of unintended consequences argument, right? That we're worried that the change in multifamily definition that allows someone to make 2 structures as opposed to 1, even though it's a discretionary special permit for the multifamily, it's not actually have the right, it's a special permit. There's concern that it's gonna have a widespread effect elsewhere, and so without actually sitting down and doing a charrette exercise, everybody said, all right, let's look at the R3 district. Let's look at the other districts where this is allowed. Let's look at how much is built out already. The way that I've tried to respond to that is, and Rick can chime in, because I know this was a concern he had raised, and we had walked through a little bit, was where could there be unintended consequences? We're not looking at this from the office's perspective, I'll say. We were not looking at the zoning change for this lot in isolation. We saw them say that they thought it was necessary for this project. That's where the conversation originated here. But Jennifer, our zoning administrator, was she had raised the concern before that a couple of years ago, for instance, when the 6C amendment was made, and 6C had previously been used for different scopes of housing, but was reduced now to single and 2-family home projects. There's no ability to do two different structures on anything larger than that. So the way that I think that I characterized that, the way that I've responded to it to the council last night, for instance, was not to look at it as if, this is all being done for one property or one developer, just because it hasn't been raised by someone here in the concept of a project, but rather to think, as we have looked at it, I see the benefits not for a developer here, not for a developer at any other given site. I actually look at it and I say, why would we want to preclude the planning board itself from looking at or being able to entertain a plan that breaks up the massing? So if someone's gonna put 4 units, why force them to go to either not allow it at all or get a variance to break up the massing, rather than just allow the board to decide if they want to allow the break up the massing or not?
At a high level, it seems like that would be an improvement. To give that option, there are plenty of examples around town of 2 structures that have been artificially joined because they have to be to meet the zoning requirement there's one on Lime Street, up the street, 2 houses, very nice houses.
Yes,
And they have this funny odd little connection because they had to.
agreed.
And it's, to me, this is an improvement to create that option that with the scale of the community and the scale of buildings that we're talking about. To give the option for multiple buildings, it seems like a significant improvement.
And I don't necessarily care.
Understand why it would be a concern.
Yeah, no, and I think it could come with like a little bit more paranoia sort of about based on a bad experience with this project or that project, or, concerns were raised with this decision or that decision. I realize that people have debates about decisions they liked or projects they didn't like, but I think, just like you, I look at this as a good thing because it allows us to break the massing, and it's not even allowed as a right, it's a discretionary. You get to decide as a board whether you're comfortable with it. So, yes, we're gonna talk about as of right housing and things in other areas, the sense of the state, but that's a different discussion, and you have control to decide what you want to do with that piece, that stuff, but that's a, 4-yard district, that's different.
This is a discretionary special permit for multifamily, and you get to decide. So to me, the upside is you get options, whereas before you're precluded as a board, and never mind the fact that they can't give you something, on their end. So this to me seems like we're at the finish line of something that was, took a couple of years to get to this point. I hope that the finer grain details that people are concerned about here don't, sandbag the whole thing, because while I don't necessarily care about people's individual agreements that they have out there, I think we've gotten to a pretty good place here, and it would seem kind of silly to have to reset the clock for everybody to restart the whole process over again. It was, the odd thing, and one odd thing was I suggested last night, two things that came up was, Council Z, I think, has suggested, we might have an overlay district, and there's a question about, why didn't we consider an overlay district? That might be a better mechanism by which to address this. I think that's perhaps an overly complicated way of, no one was suggesting a different outcome. So we're basically talking about having, redoing the process, creating an overlay district for one property or two properties, and then basically getting to the same result essentially one way or the other. The other idea that was thrown out in concept during that discussion mainly was having what is in essence, and the part of this was around the context that we have to advertise another hearing. Is it a substantive change enough that the council can just make a tweak now, or do they have to come back to the planning board, do the whole thing over, which affects all the timelines that they agreed to? Everybody trying to wrap things up. So, and again, not that we have to be sensitive to all that, but I think it's, reasonable at this point where things are. It was suggested, and this is something that some of you might find a little bit confusing if you're trying to deal with reality, is the idea of having a multifamily definition here, like we were talking about, it would be one way as opposed, as you left it here in this adjusted version, in the R3 district. So for this property and for the other R3 is just around the downtown, one definition that's like we just talked about, but the other definition staying in place for every other area in the city. So you have two, as you look at the multifamily definition, say, can you do two different structures? You allow two different structures possibly in the R3 around the downtown, where most of this is already built out and developed with too tight anyway to have a second structure. And then not other places. I don't, neither myself as a zoning administrator thought that made sense, but that was also offered as a suggested from public comment, that was offered as a suggested way to resolve this issue here of unintended consequences. I'm not convinced there's an unintended consequence as the concern here.
Preference for bigger, bulkier buildings. I just don't get it.
I understand people's underlying concerns. I just don't think that I think there's maybe a little bit too much anxiety about something that I think is pretty.
What are they concerned? I don't understand the concern with breaking it up. What is the concern?
Well, what I heard, for instance, what I heard from Council Z last night was mainly that, if you codify something as an allowance, we sometimes hear from applicants or their attorneys that is, that the council has basically determined that's something they like or they want, and therefore it should be allowed by the board, right? And the reality is that, first of all, just because the council allows something in the ordinance doesn't mean that the board has to allow it if it's a discretionary special permit, right? Just because there's a very big difference between saying something is as of right and there's no question whatsoever. This is a discretionary permit, so irrespective, as long as one of the boards is looking at it, in whether or not you think the planning board should look at it or the ZBA or both, which it can be, onerous from a permitting perspective and not necessarily efficient. Having two boards overlap, it's a relatively small scale project, and you have that discretion. There was, I would say, in the background, I think part of it is a little bit of skepticism, sort of debate about, well, do we like the planning board review or do we like the ZBA review? And there was some debate maybe here from some of the parties whether it might have been better to have the planning board look at it or have the planning board look at it too. I agree that there's certain places the planning board definitely belongs to better sort of permitting entity. I'm just not convinced this necessarily needs to be one of them because it's still relatively small scale residential, the overall composition. It's not, a dense sort of commercial area and whatnot. So I'm not convinced that we need to also toggle in this which board is doing the permitting for it. The reason I say it is because irrespective of whether it's the ZBA or the planning board, I can't imagine that either one of your boards would approve a project that would bastardize this very visible intersection. So, in addition to all the controls that are already in place to kind of minimize what could happen here down to this essentially, and a whole bunch of description about Victorian style and, blah, 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 limitations, that have spelled out here, residential only, it seems like it's being made overly complicated in my view. I think at this point we're at a good point, and I think we should all be able to hopefully see that stuff come, the gas station come down this season, and homes starting to be built there. So
So Andy, getting back to the question about the timeline, so I think I heard you say that the city council, the current game plan is for the city council to waive the rules and do first and second reading in the same time on Monday night. Is that what you said?
Well, that is what's going to be brought out of committee, and they'll have to decide if they want to do so on Monday. It was acknowledged that that was a time constraint that we were bumping up against, and that their own rules essentially were requiring this extra vote that, might create that conflict. Yes, the typical protocol is the board, the council can, when it's brought out of committee, and the council president and committee chair, I think, are prepared for the process. I will be confirming that all councilors are aware, for our discussion that we had last night, that it does require, the waiver of the rules and 2 votes in one night, essentially counting as 2 votes in one night, rather than having, the second vote 2 weeks later, just to confirm the things that they already voted. In order to not have, everybody's have to restart the process, you'd have to have another joint public hearing, even for us to get back to the exact same place we're at, never mind anything different, just to get back to the same spot we're in. Everybody involved would have to extend agreements, presumably, pay more time for this and that, but everybody have to extend agreements, and whatever arrangements they've made. And we'd have to redo the entire hearing process just to get back even just to this. So, and in my view, it's just not warranted, so.
So a related question is, you had mentioned to me, I think, that we might not need a meeting on the 21st. Is that still the case?
Correct. We, with the, as of right now, we don't have any, I can check with that in the morning, but as far as we know right now, there's no reason to be meeting on the 21st. And we had noted that, and that was part of the reason why we wanted to make sure we could take up the matter of the, permanent extension for, Minko this evening, which is now a non-issue, so.
So I guess here's a thought, and just to throw out there. I wonder whether we could consider having instead of meeting on the 21st, meet on the 28th, have a meeting on the 28th that would be that we would hold for a joint public hearing on this, just to get ahead of it, in case, just to be prepared, because I know you have a notice requirement that you probably wouldn't be able to make a notice for a meeting for the 21st, but you might be able to make a public hearing on the 28th. And I wonder if that would be something that we could consider moving ahead on, and talking to the Planning and Development Committee chair to see whether we could just to move the process forward, because there's absolutely no reason, if the council is unable to get the votes to have 2 readings on Monday night, then we need to have a new public hearing, correct? So we could, the earliest we could do that would be the 28th, probably.
Yeah, we could mechanically try to arrange for that. In some ways, I'm hesitant only because I feel like that might, potentially sort of run, in the opposite direction in terms of the potential for things to be wrapped up on Monday. First of all, there's sort of a, assumption here that the council is also on board that we need to do another hearing as we're advertising or getting going with something that may not, pan out. Probably causing, some anxiety for the other parties involved. Putting that aside for a second, just if we're not sure that the council is there, that may change or have some impact on Monday's vote, even potentially the thought that there's, more time to look at this, or everybody's sort of.
okay.
I'm just sort of wondering whether that would be
Yeah,
beneficial.
I
I
got it.
completely the statutory stuff, and I would love to do the same thing, and for that reason, but I'm hesitant, as secondary effects might not be beneficial.
Yep, okay. All right.
Happy to
when-
pick up the discussion though with them if you want, to just, as a discussion. I think it's worthwhile to have a discussion like that anyway, so, if you want with them, happy to do that with you.
I didn't catch what you said, the last part of it.
I'm happy to have that discussion with them anyway, just to consider, possible courses of action. I just not necessarily sure I would recommend it right now.
Yeah, I got it. So it would only give us an extra week, so we could schedule it for the first meeting in March, if that were the case.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
So again, if you're interested in seeing this happen, feel free to, reach out to the councilors or show up at the meeting on Monday and speak if you want, but, we'll see where the council goes, and if they do on Monday.
Okay, that was all I had, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you, that's it. I just wanted to note that if any of you wanted to, get the update on that or speak to that, and then, like I, be talking about the Everyday Community Story Avenue, stuff.
Okay. So, nothing else?
Nope. Thank you, Chair.
Motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn or second?
Okay, so roll call, Alden,
Yes.
Beth,
Yes.
Bob,
Yes.
Jamie,
Yes.
Heather,
Yes.
and I vote yes, so we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Hey,
Night.
I'm so sorry. I've been